Okay, so let's reconvene for our last panel discussion. And as I noted, we will devote the first portion of it to questions specifically directed at Professor Eisenberg and Professor Gaughan, and then we can conclude our discussion with questions that might bring our panelists together to have conversations across each other or with each other. And again, Marie Walker will be in charge of us.
Okay, well, this is our last chance to hear you and get your ideas and thoughts on this really important issue. I do want to just start out just to give a shout out to the Nobel Committee members who brought this wonderful panel of people together. And it's been an ongoing process where some people have had to drop out and some of them became faculty hosts. But I just want to say their names here. And so that's Angelique Dwyer, Darcy Donnellan, Hannah Godbout, Heidi Seltzler-Barr, Patrick Heath, Steve Bennett, Emily Odermatt, and Roxanne Anderson. And others who along the way helped in this process, I want to thank you very much too. Now, to get started, of course, we want to open it up to the panel. I know it's the end of, 2 days of lots of information, but I wonder if we could maybe start off by talking about any thoughts, questions, comments you have for Dr. Gaughan or Dr. Eisenberg on their talks. Yeah, please.
Traveling Thunder is a king, an icon, like a scientist. I think I love him. His analysis, so the white man system that he talked about, the whole framework, I just think is genius. And you said that you had, people have similar analyses as you talk to them. Can you say more about just how widespread, or how consistent his analysis is with other people that you've spoken to over the years?
Yeah, thank you. I think when you do interviews and you find a particularly illuminating interview, it's one thing to unpack it and talk about what's there. It's another thing to try to really establish its generality. And I think the proof of the generality of what Traveling Thunder had to say in most aspects is the fact that when we talk about historical trauma in American Indian and Indigenous health circles today, it is essentially that model. It has to do with colonization leading to these impacts that then, there's a intergenerational transmission of something, and what that something is open for debate or up for grabs, that then put current generations continuing at risk. And really it's trying to historicize and contextualize the kinds of suffering that we see in Indian countries so that it's not just me as an individual being defective in some way or being deficient. And that can be paralyzing when you feel that way and you don't ever try to maybe reach out for help because you're so hopeless in some respects. But historical trauma, we have what we call the 4 C's of historical trauma that kind of capture it. It's colonial in origin, that's really important. It's cross-generationally transmitted. So, kids who grew up in these boarding schools who didn't have good parenting and weren't really well cared for at these schools, are trying to raise their kids on their own, and maybe they're not so good at it for a bunch of reasons, and their kids, so that's intergenerationally passed down. It's cumulative. So, like on the Northern Plains, our peoples, in some instances, were first, killed off by the army. Those who survived were locked away on a reservation, which was essentially a prison camp. Then they were promised rations and food and survival goods that never came. That was the origin of the Dakota War here in this area, for example. They were starving because the government goods that were, agreed to by treaty didn't show up. And then you've got disease, and then you've got your kids taken out to go to these schools that you weren't really approving of and not what you would have wanted, et cetera. So it's cumulative, it snowballs across all of these different instances of colonization. And finally, it's really important that it's collective. that it's everybody has been touched and carries this legacy and has to grapple and navigate it. Now, I think sometimes historical trauma can be a little overreaching. Like, I do think that there are more responses to colonial subjugation than only, traumatic injury. I think we can also get angry. I think we can also resist. We can also bounce back. A lot of people do. And, the Indian narrative, everyone in America knows about Indians to the tiniest of degree. And if there's one thing that everyone in America knows about us, it's that we're tragic, right? Mm-hmm. But if you come to our communities, there is tragedy in our communities, but there's also a great deal of fortitude and resourcefulness and resilience and humor. I mean, Indian people can be very funny, and it's just the times when I laugh the hardest are at home or with relatives or family. And that's the part you don't get to see or don't get to hear. It's not represented. And so, yes, we have our problems. It's a subset of people, families in our communities who have these problems. It's a larger subset that you might find in Middle America for some of these problems, but the majority of people don't have these problems. And yet are trying to contend with poverty and all of the disadvantages and adversities that are the heirs of dispossession and, getting a raw deal in America.
Yeah, please, Dr. Barrett.
Thank you. Thank you both for very interesting, very different approaches and talks. And I do have a question at the end of a few sentences of what I'm going to say, and that refers to the idea of the evidence gap. Daniel was talking about the evidence gap, referring mainly to the idea that the evidence we have is not always attended to, and that we don't always do the right thing, let's say, in relation to that evidence. And I guess on that, just a quick note to say that we also don't capture always evidence of best practices. So just to complete that idea, there's a lot going on that is amazing, but if it's not captured, and if it's not captured, it can get lost, which connects then to the idea that Joseph was pointing out, which is we don't need evidence as much as we need to listen to the ways people find meaningful to address their needs. So it all seems to be connected and contradictory, but I wonder whether the way out of this contradiction is to think that perhaps we do have a place for evidence that is perhaps an important place to gather the kinds of resources we need to support the activities that are needed, but there are many different ways of gathering evidence, and there's many different types of evidence, and perhaps that's what needs to be focused on. But I don't want to give the answer. This is just my interpretation of where the middle term might be. What do you think?
Maybe I'll add, I think there's another angle that could help reconcile that kind of what looks like a contradiction between the two of us is actually economics, for all its limitations, I think one strength of economics is that it basically says the best judge of whether an individual is better off is that person, the choices that person makes. So what better way to determine whether somebody wants to or is better off doing something or receiving something than actually whether they decide to participate or receive that. And the problem, of course, is that a lot of our evidence, as Joe mentioned, a lot of evidence does not include certain groups. So we don't even know, we don't have the evidence. But I think if we did collect the evidence and we based our outcomes on what are the valued outcomes for the people with whom we were collecting the evidence, then I think we could actually use evidence to support our decisions.
Can I just follow up with that? I just had some concerns and similar questions about, who published the, papers on the evidence. Were they qualified to know whether these programs were good for people of color? And as you work on your book, I'm sure they're going to be, the world basically is going to be looking at your book and thinking about, do these programs work? And in most cases, we actually don't know if they work for everybody. We might know if they work for white kids, right? And so do you explicitly say in your book that you are not speaking for all populations, the evidence might be sound for, white populations, but not for others.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have concerns because I have sat on review committees for social and emotional learning, Institute for Education Sciences. They repeatedly fund, majority populations who have zero training, with people of color, aren't qualified to, in a lot of cases, to collect data, to design programs for people of color, but yet consistently they were the ones getting funded, right? And so just like questioning, the evidence.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I'd say we've partially, I think, made those points, but I think this is really helping me. We're in the final stages of revising the book, so I think we're going to now do it more effectively, so I appreciate it.
And did you want to respond to the question as well?
Yeah, so we can question what counts as evidence and why, and alternative construals of evidence. And then the problem, I think, is that one group's evidence can be another group's lack of evidence, So evidence-based practice in mental health is premised on the idea that we can't know off the tops of our heads what really helps people recover from mental health problems. That's a very difficult thing to know. And the late clinical psychologist Scott Lilienfeld published a paper that has something like almost 30 reasons why you think a treatment worked when it really didn't. So off the tops of our heads, there's sort of limitations in our ability to reason. And the idea of these kinds of scientific approaches is to try to expand or extend our rationality and to see or detect patterns that we can't see without statistics, for example. It's in some ways like a cognitive prosthesis, these statistics, these scientific approaches. It extends our ability to know things. Well, if Indian people are saying, especially with traditional precedent, that first-person experience is the pinnacle, well, you've got a huge divergence right there in terms of the deep skepticism and suspicion of personal experience. Like clinicians will tell you, I do what I do because it helps my patients. I don't need to know how scientists have vetted and validated these things because I know it works, I see it every day. And yet, as Daniel pointed out, the uptake of these evidence-based approaches is so small for the very reasons I'm saying. So, I think it isn't always just a question of definition, it's also a question of what counts as what for whom and how to have those dialogues and discussions. I think Indian people can be engaged in a dialogue in which there can be skepticism about personal experience in a way where they might be more open than otherwise. But I'll tell you this, Indian people have been subject to bureaucratic rationality for so long in our history that our faith in that ability to improve our lives is nil.
Yeah, Dr. Alper, please.
Yeah, I had a question for Joseph in particular. I guess thinking about the youth angle on some of the work that you're doing, and I guess for me it's so focused on like how young people are using technology to connect with one another. I'm specifically thinking about other young people, but very often that positions young people against adults, like adults not understanding what kids are into and interested in, but you're also kind of really a paradigm shift around that where elders are so central to a culture. And so the idea that, adults don't understand our culture because it's youth, that like youth-adult doesn't operate in this space. So that's, I think, really interesting because I realized I was going to ask a question about, I also know that internet connectivity is something that's very like choppy, that is not necessarily, broadband is not widespread, across sort of Indian country, and that's also like a failure of the government on another level. But to what extent is social media, like young people connecting and sharing, like resources, if it's about creating one's own community and sharing one's own culture, and now we have, I guess, other tools for digitally creating resources or, being able to archive history in ways that didn't exist before, and whether that's like native medicine or, that but that's also maybe in contrast to oral culture or, the culture of physical gatherings. So I guess that's a lot of different questions altogether. But just the question of sort of young people's relationship around these mental health issues with elders in the community, and to what extent peer support, the internet. But I'll add another caveat there, that the internet I know can be a minefield for Native youth. Like nobody needs to see like somebody's Halloween costume and like a Native headdress and then be exposed to that, because being online also exposes you to some terrible imagery that doesn't make you feel good either necessarily. But yeah, so that's sort of my question.
I mean, anyone who's Indian in America and accesses popular culture in any sense encounters those stereotypes all the time, every day. I think I said to the students in our meeting yesterday, Indians are simultaneously everywhere and nowhere in America. You can drive down your streets and see the street names, the mountain names, the streams names, the state names, the city names that are Native names, for example. And yet, in terms of ever interacting with an identified Native American person, that's a pretty rare experience for most Americans. In our community, elders are venerated precisely because they have a long duration of that very first-hand personal experience that is the most authoritative way to know things. And so whether we call that knowledge or wisdom or whatever, they are so important. And my people, the Aani people, were one of 5 tribes in North America to actually be literally age-graded for men. That men sequentially moved through a bunch of stages together over the course of their adult lives, recognized by different ceremonial inductions and cohorts of men. And the elders, of course, ran everything. In fact, I think from a young person's perspective, you could almost criticize that of being a gerontocracy. I mean, I don't know what young people, I don't know how much power they have, potential, and they did things, but it was old people who called the shots. And it still is the case that old people call the shots on many important things. But the other counterbalancing aspect is this respect or regard for personal autonomy, and that you don't intrude and make other people do things, except in very rare circumstances. So maybe there is some counterbalancing to that. With respect to young people, I think that there are a lot of interesting projects that use technology like photo voice, which we heard, and Nikki talked about that as a methodology, where people are trying to wrestle with their experiences and get that photographed and set to music. And those have been really interesting to see how young people are working on identity issues in Indian country through projects like that. Another big way that young people are reproducing indigenous cultural forms is through language revitalization. That's really common around reservations throughout the country. Most communities are concerned with that, and digital platforms play a huge role in that, from recording and having a video of elder speaking. And there's been great stuff even around this old form of what was called sign talk. On the plains there was a sense of when you talked, you gestured in accordance with what you're saying, so people could meet and talk who didn't understand each other's language, but could still understand each other because of the sign talk was what was common, not the spoken language. And so this system of gesture and communication was such that, a video is necessary to sort of, I could still see my grandma telling me stories in which how she held her body, how she used space, how she, that's the kind of thing that won't be reproduced unless, people are learning that in sync with language stuff. And so I think digital access in that front has been really important for that effort. Facebook is huge. Why? Because it's free. You can Facebook message people. You can communicate over Facebook without paying money. And if you live in a poor community, that's really important. So that's I think other youth cultures might have left Facebook behind long ago. That's not true in Indian country. Anyway, those are some thoughts. And the orality I wanted to say. I think some of the work that I do is taking the writings of my great-grandfather, Fred Gahn. I told you his story. In 1941-42, he was employed at the Fort Belknap Reservation to record, folklore was what it was called. He wrote 700 longhand pages of biography, of coup tales, of myths, and a biography of our most famous medicine person. And I'm in the process of trying to edit that and get that published as an entire collection that's faithful to the way he recorded it and so on. But the issue there is the transition from orality to literacy, and there's been scholarship about, the different kind of mentalities that are associated with oral tradition and written traditions. The main difference being that writing distances from things. And there's all kinds of implications from what that distance might mean to making science possible in the way we think of science, like in university modern life, and so on. And so I do think that it is interesting to think about what the oral tradition means when it's recorded and archived and online. You know, if an older traditional model of what it means to give thought life through breathing and vocation is like an impact metaphysically on the world. What does it mean if that's recorded and put on a website? You know? So I think there are implications of these things that we haven't traced out in all kinds of interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. I cannot help but say at this moment, my entire discipline is grounded in the work of a man who did not believe in writing. Socrates objected to things being written down, and we venerate the writings about Socrates, which has always seemed to me a deep contradiction and a suggestion that, you know, Western philosophy ought to stop right now, perhaps. And I'm just kidding.
We do have some questions here. Are there other things that, before we go on to those, that you wanted to ask or add?
I would like to ask Daniel a question. So you were talking about the social emotional learning programs, and of course I don't know a lot about how they operate in the US or what the discussions have been, and maybe that's exactly what's been discussed, I have no idea. But one of the things that strikes me is that there was this, for example, this whole relational aspect to it, right? And of course, relationships are governed by different norms in different subcultures. And so I wonder whether those programs tend to be culturally informed or whether they are actually, which would be, favorable for inclusion and for people to be able to be flexible about accepting and valuing and celebrating each other's ways of being social, or whether they are actually assimilative tools.
Yeah, I mean, there's hundreds of SEL programs, so it's I think it really varies by program. I certainly don't know about all of them. I do think, related to your point, I think SEL programs have come under fire recently from, I think, kind of more conservative parts of groups within the country, because some of the programs do have kind of social justice elements to them explicitly, and even have been accused of incorporating critical race theory. And so I think, SEL, and I think it makes sense because social emotional development, a lot of it has to do with understanding the cultural context that we're all in, and the differences and the backgrounds of people around us, and identities that lots of people have within each community. But it has made it more complicated, I think, from a political point of view. And now, like, the state of Florida is trying to practically ban SEL programs. So I know that's not quite a direct response to your question, but I think it gets very complicated. I don't know if, Brandisha, maybe you might know more than I do about kind of how some of the SEL programs might actually incorporate the considerations she's asking about. I don't know, from your education expertise, but from what I've seen, it's not, for most of the most evidence-based programs, that's not a big emphasis. It's really an attempt to kind of hone in on some things that we hope might be universally helpful. But, the caveats that we've been talking about all apply.
Okay, well, thank you. We have some interesting questions, and I think this one in particular, there's talk of, and there has been for a long time, of reparations to both peoples identifying as American Indian and Black Brown people. And so how, if this were to happen, what do you think of reparations, and what, if anything, might be a better alternative, or whether it might impact the mental health of young people in some way to make them?
I think it's for you.
Pardon me?
I know you was looking at us, but I think it's a question for you.
Yeah, Joseph and
Well,
Dr. Ghana, and of course Dr. Todd.
Yeah. I teach at Harvard. Harvard just released a report on Harvard and the legacy of slavery last spring. And in that report, it traced the tawdry history of the fact that Harvard has been deeply entangled in a legacy of enslavement of African American people and of Native American indigenous people throughout its history. Slavery in New England, when it began, was native slavery, actually. But most of the enslaved people who are named in that report were of African American descent. And so Harvard set aside $100 million to try to engage in ongoing repair and reconciliation around those issues, including to both people of African descent and people of Native American indigenous descent. And I'm proud that our president, Larry Bacow, took this initiative on and is trying to make some effort, not only to apologize and to admit wrongdoing, but to find a way forward. I would say for indigenous people, repair and reconciliation in general is a very important thing to do. For us, the issue has been land and dispossession of land. So one way to think about America is that it was founded on stolen African labor and stolen Indian land. And the violent dispossession that led to the taking of land everywhere throughout America is a history that has been erased. And so recovery of that history and recovery of renewed relationships through reconciliation, I think, is crucially important. I think that Americans cannot have an appropriate understanding of themselves and their nation without being in proper and restored relationships to Native and Black people, among others. And so I think it begins with outreach and connection to and dialogue with surrounding Native communities. There are lots of Native communities in the state of Minnesota. There are some not far from here. And a recognition and acknowledgement of those histories, including the ugly facts of something that happened here at Mankato in the 1860s, for example, and the details of the Dakota War, and the long and tawdry history of neglect and abuse and those sorts of things. Because until those histories are acknowledged, apologized for, and some repair is made, we can't tell an American story to be proud of that isn't false. We need a new way to talk about who we are as Americans that is inclusive of all of us. And so I think it's crucially important that institutions and communities reach out and undertake this effort.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to move us more towards more general questions for the panel and talk about, someone has given in the question about a public health crisis, and if we looked at this issue of mental health in young people more widely as a public health crisis, as Dr. Loy, Dr. Alper, and Dr. Eisenberg had mentioned, especially within the context of racial ethnic differences in mental illness severity. So how might this affect factors like stigma, bias, or access to care?
I can at least talk about it in the context of autism. So there's a really storied history of like how autism came to be diagnosed and who was studied under the first sort of models of what autism is. But it's in its contemporary form, especially through the DSM, there was a moment where sort of autism was defined as a category to be explicitly a white diagnosis, which led to then certain kinds of resources being associated with it. And childhood schizophrenia got to be then the category that children of color got to be kind of under, which was not then connected to the kinds of resources that autism was connected to. And that history of misdiagnosis or of gaps in receiving a diagnosis sort of traces to this day, where you have kids who, and I write about in my book, who receive emotional disturbance diagnoses as opposed to autism, and then they miss out on all of these services that could have helped them as they grow up, because they don't then get connected to that in terms of public school education here in the U.S. So I think some research has shown that those gaps are starting to close somewhat, but the whole aspect of culturally specific services, culturally rooted, like who's delivering the services, and primarily how white the delivery of those services are, continues to be a repeated barrier in how effective any of those services can actually be. Like the service professions are very white and like cis women oriented. And so how, and whether or not those systems are then appropriate in general, thinking about Professor Gahn's work, like, that system itself might not then be a functioning system to begin with. But I just think I personally think learning the history of diagnosis and medicine in this way, like the way that the DSM pathologized, being gay, the way that it was, constructed as a pathology, that I think that's a history that people don't talk about when we define what is healthy, what is considered quote unquote normal, and how normal gets constructed around these specific categories. That I just think that I wish that was part more of general education, more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does anyone else want to address that sort of mental health treated as a public health crisis, or I can go on to the next question, or no? Okay.
I guess maybe I just in terms of you mentioned access to care in that question as well, and while we haven't I think emphasized clinical services all that much in this panel. With another aspect of the so-called crisis is the difficulty in finding a provider for those families and children who do want mental health care, whether it's a psychiatrist or a therapist. And it's even that issue is even worse, I think, for families of color who would like to find a provider who shares some aspect of their identity. So I think and particularly not just because it's partially because of where people live and the availability of providers in those areas, and partially because there's underrepresentation of people of color in the workforce. So that's another dimension of the issue in terms of access that I think it's going to need a lot of work.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I guess, so not so much on the mental health aspect of it, because my expertise is more on loneliness, but on loneliness itself. So there's a parallel there, because there's a lot of people writing about how it is an epidemic and how, and so on. And that has been a double-edged sword. So it has, of course, been helpful in one way, because it has drawn attention to the issue and liberated some resources to start thinking about the issue in more concrete and effective ways and so on. But at the same time, it has led to a lot of popular writing that has been highly stigmatizing, a lot of media coverage that, calling loneliness the leprosy of the 21st century, or equating it to a plague, or talking about loneliness as contagious. It's counterproductive, really, because who wants to go close to someone who's contagious? And being close to someone is the whole point when addressing loneliness, of course. So we do need to be very careful about how we talk about these things to reap the benefit of the attention that is drawn to them. But I don't know if there is a clear parallel in mental health.
Okay. Thank you.
I would just quickly add that, as I tried to say in the wake of a presentation like I offered, that no amount of mental health services, or indeed of any health services, is going to remedy the ills of Indian country. The problems that we have are, as Traveling Thunder talked about, historical and spiritual, and they have to do with legacies of disadvantage that healthcare cannot fix. It's not designed to fix those kinds of issues. And so I think the larger question this raises is to what degree is medicalization useful? Under what conditions is medicalization useful? We're talking about youth mental health, but a lot of what we talked about isn't mental disorder. Again, it's stress or distress, or maybe shading into injury. Some cases, maybe mental disorder, although there can be resistance to even whether some things are best thought of as a mental disorder. But in any case, I think that, if we medicalize those things, we get the benefit of access to resources and an access to someone who we can say it's your job to fix it. But there's very strong limitations on, and there's actual, side effects if you will, of doing that, of medicalizing things as well, in which, social justice issues get reframed as a problem between an individual patient and her doctor. And that's not how social justice issues are going to be, ultimately resolved. And so I think we have to be careful with the tantalizing allure of medicalization and the healthcare sector to solve problems. So let me just close in my remarks today just briefly with a comment to young people and mental health. I can understand why young people are contending with mental health struggles in this day and age, given all that's gone on in the past 15, 20 years, 9/11, and you've got the war on terror, then you've got 2008 and the recession, and a whole bunch of people, not just working class people who've been struggling for a long time to find ways to continue to make a livelihood, but suddenly middle class people, college graduates weren't able to find beyond the usual expected path to careers. And, that's the middle class sort of, the value of freedom and authentic expression. A career is the way that's done. And when that gets even for the middle classes, then you've got trouble. We've got a looming climate crisis that's, and not much being done about it. That we've now got racial reckoning that sort of seemed like it could be possible, but it's not clear what's happened to that at this point. There's so many troubles in the world right now that I think if I were young, I would be very disappointed. And I think, if we take a lesson from Traveling Thunder about the consequences of anomie, of a loss of a sense of who you are, where you belong, what you're supposed to do, what's your purpose, then we can recognize that, it could be a really tough time. And yet, I will just suggest that maybe the answer to this is not so much counseling and psychotherapy, and I don't want to, those things can help, take advantage of them, but probably getting involved in some kind of purposeful action to save this planet and to restore this society. And I know you all are already doing a lot of that, but finding common cause around those kinds of issues might in effect resolve some of the loneliness and some of the uncertainty and some of the alienation, et cetera, that otherwise are so difficult to face and contend with. And Lord knows you have a lot to sort out, I'm sorry to say. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
I'm sort of torn because it seems to me that it's like, okay, so what do we tell young people? What do we tell practitioners? We have a bunch of questions. I don't know.
You're the boss.
There are different themes that are coming out of this. And I know at lunch we talked about what are questions that are important to ask. And what are your thoughts on what we do now for people who are practitioners, people who want to help young people, researchers, and for the audience, the people who are out there who want to help themselves or help their families? Where do we go from here? Yeah, Mayor, Dr. Alper.
I think I'd be like reading books, but books are knowledge and are power, and it might be a zine, it might be, something else, but I think that there's so many forms of knowledge that are outside of like textbooks and, journals that are prestigious, that have high impact factors or whatever, but the ways that community knowledge get shared, like someday, it might be on Twitter these days, it might be collected in self-published books, it might be, through these more creative practices. But I think looking outside of the forms of how knowledge is produced that have been historically gatekept, that kind of curiosity without also being, feeling like you know because you finished the book or something. But I think that kind of innate, developing that kind of innate curiosity to wonder how much you have not been exposed to, and then follow through with that kind of a disposition, because people get very defensive very quickly and very easily. And so I don't know how that comes through in the kinds of classes that people take when they're in these kind of programs that are meant to, train folks. But I just think that, at least when I think about in the disability community, how much folk knowledge and wisdom is so counter to what the textbooks and what the published literature says, and how harmful that material is, and yet people keep getting trained on those same literatures. This comes up a lot, is then like citing and giving reference to those people. So sometimes knowledge gets extracted and then not acknowledged and not given credit to. So I think more of that can happen for clinicians and practitioners in a broad way.
To help them take perspective and okay, yeah. Are there others that have something to add to that about what researchers or...
I agree that books can be amazing sources of knowledge about other types of lives, other worlds, other ways of being. Films also, but I also think about representation, really. I think we talk a lot about that, but perhaps it becomes a little bit banal. But if you think of schools, for example, to actually encourage teachers to represent different types of identities and show students the example and be a safe haven for the student if they have questions or want support, but also bring in speakers to schools that talk about lived experience of this and that and are able to then stay longer and talk to students. That kind of thing can really make all the difference between feeling valued or not, having the vocabulary to express yourself and your questions and your doubts or not. So, I'm sure there's a lot of schools already doing this, but not all of them are. And a lot of it is because they don't have the resources to do it. So we go back to the big picture again, but it has to start somewhere, and I do think that gathering the evidence will be important to get those resources to multiply and to continuing.
Okay, yeah.
I think we've partially maybe kind of painted a gloomy picture about the situation facing young people today, but I think we maybe haven't talked enough about a reason to be very hopeful, which is an asset that young people have today, which is that I think it's clear that young people are more knowledgeable and more motivated to address mental health than ever before, more familiar. Not that, of course there's variation across individuals and so forth, but I think we have all kind, even I'm sure at Gustavus there's probably multiple student organizations dedicated, I've heard about some of them dedicated to wellness in the community. So I think more broadly, there's just an opportunity to empower young people to actually be a part of the solution and to promote well-being within their own communities, which they understand better, I think, than we do as researchers, like kind of external folks.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Lloyd, Dr. Lloyd first, and then.
I think sort of maybe part of I've been thinking, just absorbing. So sort of to your previous question about maybe pertaining to ethnic and racial disparities and what does that mean in terms of stigma, I think what I've taken away from the other presenters and kind of shared conversations here is that we can all learn from one another, and by contextualizing and decontextualizing and then putting it back together, what it means by mental health, and from very different perspectives, different ways of expressing distress, different ways of understanding distress, not necessarily as disorders, but as historical trauma, as systemic oppression and racism, and all forms of isms. Hopefully, I think, kind of like Dr. Eisenberg just mentioned, empowered in a way that we can maybe start to really destigmatize mental health problems and allow people to talk more about sort of what environments are doing to us and not just something wrong within us. And maybe then we can collectively come together and kind of have those conversations and solutions. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training and still, work with clinical psychology doctoral students and folks who want to go into the traditional American health professions, and we oftentimes get to the point about not only racial trauma but just all kinds of trauma and distress and problems that we see in the consulting room is, well, it's really not just really psychopathology, it's pathology in our society. So that kind of goes back to your question of now what? Like, what do we do? I think as maybe clinical psychologists, I sometimes feel like our hands are a little bit tied. We have some tools to help one-on-one, but we need to go broader than that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Dr. Tynes?
So this is in response to the question about, what we do. I think both as, a college student or the lay person here and researchers or people who are serving communities, we need racial literacy. Yolanda Seeley-Ruiz has a racial literacy development framework that I recommend everybody sort of take a look at. And a part of developing racial literacy, and I think this is important, in the U.S. context, but also around the world because white supremacy is global, and so an important part is this archaeology of self, where you're really sort of doing a deep dive, a deep excavation of, your own beliefs and how you have come to know what you know about different people. And I think also, as you develop your racial literacy, sort of having a sense of humility and learning everything that you can, just devouring, like I said yesterday, the banned books and connecting with people, getting mentors to help you on your racial literacy journey. And I think once you have racial literacy, from policymakers to teachers to, everyone, to clinicians who are serving people in terms of their mental health, once they have racial literacy development, you have a base. You can actually begin to change the world. But yeah, I think that's a key for just about every stakeholder involved in our journey to equity and mental health.
Okay. Dr. Eider.
Yeah, one of the things that I would add, and I know I've said this before, but I encourage people to be in community with youth, talk to youth, ask them what they need, ask them to be involved in the decision making. So the project that I presented, and I think it was Dr. Eisenberg who actually used the language of YPAR, so Youth Participatory Action Research, that project falls under that category. And I think it's important to kind of to name that because, the communities that we're talking about, so much information is often extracted and also is not credited to them, and also they don't get to be the decision makers. And for projects like that or being in conversations, you can have them be a part. So when we're talking about research, have them be involved from the beginning to the end. The participants in the presentation all gave me permission, so to speak, to be able to present their work, right? They are involved in all of the decisions around it. And also how the data will be used, and I think that this is important because it is their words. This is what they want people to know. And they want people to know the hardships. They want people to know the joys that they have. And they also want people to know that the system is broken for them. It was never designed for them, and they want to figure out a way to fix that. And to Dr. Joseph Gahn's comment around thinking about ways to be more action-oriented, this is also what they're asking for, at least for trans youth and trans people of color. There is research that says one of the biggest resiliency factors that they ask for is to meet other trans people and also specifically other trans activists, because then they can be in the action of actually creating something different for themselves. It's this part of dreaming and doing that is so important. And I think so much gets consumed in like the adults are making the decisions because we're the ones with the jobs or with the power to give out funding and all of that, but really like we need to have their voices in it.
There's another question from our audience, and it is, accepting that there are cultural differences, can the panelists talk about some things that all young people require for their mental health, regardless of their culture? Can they talk about what they are and how they can be provided?
I'm sorry, what was the last part?
What young people require for their mental health, regardless of their culture, can they talk about what they are and how to provide them?
What those things are that young people
Yes,
need.
and I think that's maybe speaking to nurturing environments. Okay, next question. So, these are some...
maybe I'll just state the obvious. I think like
Okay.
there's kind of like what we often call basic needs, like food security, safety, and I think for young in a shelter. So I think those are sometimes underappreciated, I think, aspects of what leads to mental health. And I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would venture to say those are universal across cultures.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want the person to think we don't find the question important. I just think we feel that we've been talking about that precisely. So probably the question was posed some time ago. But yeah, the kinds of things we've been talking about, I think we all feel these are the kinds of things that need to be provided, really, or need to be done.
I think another universal is a good night's sleep. And there's a lot of work on like sleep inequality. So if you can just think about who has to work overnight shifts and then who has to do then extra work at home afterwards, who has childcare, who doesn't, all that stuff, and young people who may be providing some of that care themselves on top of going to school, on top of working and earning money for their families at the same time. But we know how. Like there's a lot of research that's saying sleep is important for mental health, but it's unequally studied, especially when it comes to, okay, how diverse are the samples that are being studied that historically have not. So I've talked about sleep a bunch, but it's really so central to how our bodies regulate and how we're able to reset and recover and restore. Especially for bodies that are going through so many changes through puberty, through adolescence, like a whole new you each day for a certain number of years. And so I think that that's something where there hasn't been enough research on how, I mean, it also, though, of course, then is a systemic issue. It's not like a pill, although so many times that's what the treatment is given. But I think the focus on that, the ways that we can reorganize things like school days or the schedules to make that a priority and not just like an afterthought is something that, and that goes to the culture of work,
Right.
more than anything else. But I don't know, sleep is a big deal.
As luck would have it, 2024 Nobel Conference is about sleep. So we'll be consulting with Dr. Alper, obviously.
So it's really hard to say universals, right? Because there are lots of racial differences in who actually gets enough sleep. And so, like, I would say that, love, everybody needs love for, their mental health, but like the ways that people feel loved and, the beautiful poem kept repeating, trans loved, right? How we love people, how people feel seen, is going to be different. And so I hesitate to look for universals. We have to do the hard work to figure out what the unique needs are of people, and then sort of move from there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I have two quick thoughts. One is the universals are hard. I mean, I think that there are contours that matter a lot. And on the other hand, I never thought I would be someone saying this on a stage like this. For modern life in particular, in terms of going concerns, I mean, Freud said work and life, right? And I think those are two huge domains that people have to sort out and make a difference. And the second thought is I wonder if mental health isn't to some degree like happiness. If you aim for happiness, you may not find it. But if you find purpose and a way to contribute, happiness is sort of a byproduct. And in some ways, that's what I'm suggesting. Many of us are psychologists. I don't think all of us are, but many of us are psychologists here. And the challenge of being a psychologist is we're trained and we're interested in thinking in here, right? But paradoxically, that leaves the structural untouched if you only are looking in here, right? It's out there where transformation has to happen. And I do wonder if, the paradox of mental health is to be less in here and more out there, and that good mental health may follow. Just a question.
Mm-hmm. What do you think must change politically and or culturally for there to be widespread public support to invest financially in youth mental health? So what must change politically or culturally to get widespread public support for investing financially in mental health, youth mental health?
Well, the Senate needs to pass the Equity and Mental Health Act that has gone through the House. Please. Let's start there.
I don't know, I'm gonna say banning assault weapons would be pretty good to, work on it, considering just how much that is central to young people's not well-being in the U.S. and the U.S. in particular.
Yeah, I think this is a tricky question in terms of the field that I'm in or that I've been talking about, because there is an incredible social political backlash happening against trans youth right now, and some of the information that is being spread around is misinformation or misinterpretations of studies and data that is out there. So one of the things that I think needs to happen is that the information that is getting distilled to the people who have the powers to make these decisions need to be critical consumers of this information, because a lot of it is inaccurate and is very skewed. And I also think that for the states that are willing and able to put in the work, which is a lot of states, for them to be refuge states, for them to work with their counties and their state legislators to create that. I think that would be important, especially with the direction of some of the southern states that have already banned healthcare for trans youth.
I guess, of course, as an economist, my mind goes to incentives and what are the incentives for politicians, and how do we judge politicians' performance? Unfortunately, we have a terrible way of judging. The only numbers we really seem to focus on are unemployment rates, inflation rates, which, by the way, are not the president really actually has very little impact on. And so economic indicators, GDP, that kind of thing, which should be very clear from this discussion, is so beside the point relative to equity and youth mental health. So I guess this is not easy, but could we somehow better measure youth mental health and equity, and have some kind of accountability some way of at least attributing some of that to the people who are making the big decisions and allocating the funds and the power in our society. That might sound like a pipe dream, but I think that maybe is the direction we need to try to go.
And in terms of the economics of mental health, what we know and what community psychology that I brought up on an earlier panel really contributes is an emphasis on prevention. So prevention actually is cost effective, and that's in dollars and cents, but it actually prevents people from suffering to begin with when it's done well. And it can be shown to do well. So Head Start was a prevention program, for example, that got widespread public support a long time ago. So there are these initiatives or endeavors that can keep people from ever going off the rails or off track into suffering, dysfunction, however you think about it. And it's actually cost effective. It just doesn't align with the political stuff, because it takes a long time for those effects to really be registered. And so finding a way to invest more in prevention instead of rehabilitation in the way we do in the medical system seems like an obvious thing to try, but somehow it's politically very difficult.
I'd say that in the field of loneliness, one thing that has helped in the UK was precisely that report that quantified the cost of loneliness to employers. Now, obviously, that's only one small aspect of the cost of loneliness, so we need economists to be interested in the rest of life, not just in work and employers, but that's a really key contribution, because politicians and those in power do attend to costs, and that suddenly becomes important as an issue. So, the cost of poor mental health in a more holistic way, rather than simply, how much medical costs do these people represent, might actually be helpful in this regard.
Okay. I guess it's one last question, and this is one that was posed at our table at lunch, and the question is, and this I've got lots of answers to, but I'm leaving it up to you. So what do you want the outcome of this conference to be for youth mental health? You've invested a lot of time, thought, research, etc. Yeah,
I guess
Dr. Loy.
I'll go first and let folks really close off the conference. So I think I had one answer, and then from lunch, and then as the talk went on today, I think I had another added thought. So I think for me, I was reminded after this afternoon's talk particularly, one of my sort of favorite quotes is, I'm paraphrasing, that we are like all peoples, and we're like some peoples, and we're also like no persons. So from a psychologist standpoint that Dr. Gan just mentioned, we tend to think about maybe individual differences, or like we're all similar in terms of our genetic makeup in some ways. So we all have telomeres. We're all gonna, age in some ways. And at the same time, our shared environments also facilitate certain kind of outcomes. At the same time, we're also very unique because the constellations of our environments and our lived experiences and accumulation. And I think what I've taken away from this conference is we have different perspectives, and I think we also shed light on how there are shared experiences and uniqueness from different facets, in terms of sexual and gender orientation, sexual orientation and gender identities, and racial and ethnic backgrounds, and disability and ability statuses, and and sort of indigenous status and so forth. So I think one thing that I think can be maybe a common thread that can hopefully sort of propel some of our continued conversation is empathy. I think that is one thing that I think is so important, and I think at lunch we were talking about, sometimes we retreat from talking about differences or our unique experiences because there may not be shared, like safe spaces, or they may not be the time and energy to communicate our needs and how we live our life and how we make meaning. So hopefully this is a start of some additional conversations about empathy and kind of humility in understanding one another and creating those safe spaces and communities. So that's kind of something that I think what I've been thinking.
Okay. Yeah, Dr.
just go in
do you want
order
to
or
just go down
something?
the line if you're comfortable with that? Okay.
Yeah. I'll just say, I guess, two things. One, I hope that everybody in the audience in some capacity has felt seen by the different array of presentations, which I think, and I can't speak for everybody else on the panel, but the array of perspectives and backgrounds and lived experiences is not typical, especially in like the field of psychology or even economics. And mental health in general. So I think that's a credit to the Nobel. I think the people who brought everybody here together. And then the other is sometimes the word paradigm shift maybe is like too broad, but I think there's a lot of little ways where a lot of people's presentations, I think there's clues that were dropped to reorienting something like what part is the problem and what part is the solution, and is what I thought was the solution sometimes the problem. And it's that kind of fundamental questioning that I hope comes out of, and I know I'm really grateful for anybody who's come up to me after my talk to talk about how maybe some of that changed some of that for them, but I think that those kinds of really turning something on its head in that way is something that I hope comes out of this.
Okay, thank you.
I guess we're going in order. I have a lot of ideas about, what I hope would come out of this, but I'll just say that I hope everybody knows that they can play a role in promoting equity and mental health, no matter who you are. You can change your community, you can better the life of people, who were your friends. You can make sure that, you have the racial literacy that you need to participate in our democracy, to participate in the communities that you live in, and to make sure that everybody, feels like they belong. So just recognizing your power and then, doing the work that you need to ensure that, people around you, that there's equity in mental health, at least in your circle, and then eventually we'll realize it across the country.
Thank you.
I think for the young people in the room or who are listening online, I similarly to what Brindisha just said, I do hope that you realize that it's really not just saying, we really want to listen, and we want to listen to your voices. And we as the researchers, but also the teachers in us, the lecturers in us, and many others, I am sure. So, your experiences are your experiences. We don't know about them from reading books. For the teachers, I hope that there is a bit also more motivation to really try and, in their schools, think about that structure and what is offering and what is not offering, what is asphyxiating and what's actually a space of freedom for their students. But also for the researchers, if any researchers were listening, to really be a lot more open to diversifying their samples. And if not, then make sure that you only talk about the sample that you have and do not extrapolate to the world when really all you're talking about is a particular group of people. This is really a problem in psychology because we do aim to be very universal in the knowledge that we gather, but that aim is really not realized unless the samples we look at are universal and unless they are seen as such and respected in the process as such. So those three for now.
But don't diversify your sample if you don't have the training to study those people.
that.
I think for me, speaking to, since my presentation was specifically to the trans and non-binary community, for people that are listening, one of the things I want them to take away is that you are seen, you are beautiful, and you deserve to have this space. And I think that that is true for all the communities that we're talking about, but because my presentation was focused on them, I wanted to highlight that. And I think, one of the running themes throughout many of the presentations is to remember that so much of what is happening to people is not the individuals, the individual is not the problem, quote unquote, and that we need to think beyond the individual while also not forgetting the individual because they're the person who's being affected. And it goes out to communities, of course. And so we need to be more creative with our solutions. We need to also advocate for those solutions in schools, in education, larger education systems, and at the policy level, and to help them understand why this is important, because I think there's some people who see it as important and some that don't. And to also not question, and I bring this up only because I felt like some of the questions that we were being asked, there was this sort of underlying question of whether racism or oppression is still happening. It 100% is still happening.
My hopes, I think, have a lot of overlap with what has already been said, so I'll just keep it short. My hope is that this conference has helped create and further a sense of shared purpose, and a greater appreciation for the challenge of youth mental health and equity issues surrounding youth mental health, but also of the opportunities. So as others have said, I think there's hopefully a lot of ideas and inspiration to get more involved from whatever walk of life or perspective you might have.
Dan's referencing the challenge of going at the end of this line, right? All the good stuff has been said, the insightful ideas are offered. I'll just close by talking maybe to young people in this room, and we have very bright lights. I know there's a section up here, there's maybe a little section back there. I think I've made reference already to, how much we spend time in here, how much we spend time out there. They're not mutually exclusive. You have to spend some time in here to know what it is you have to contribute out there. But we have serious challenges facing our society and our species. And you probably are more acutely aware of those in some way that anxiety registers perhaps in a way that someone my age maybe doesn't have to be in quite the same way, because I don't have the same time horizon you have. But we are looking to and counting on you to do the necessary work of, yes, spending time in here adequate enough to be able to get out there and save this planet. And every generation has its trials, every generation has its struggles, every generation has older people thinking they've gone to hell in a handbasket, but we know that's not true of you. We know you will rise to this occasion, and we want to, with breath bated, wait to see what it is you're going to show us over time. So don't get so tied up in here that you lose your way. You've got to find your way out there to save our species and this planet. We look to you to do that. Thank you.
What I would say, and this was something, once again, we talked about at lunch, is I hope 10 years from now, when we are looking back at what has been said, that many of the problems that have been suggested as out there, that they're fixed or changed, or there's forward progress and a better recognition of youth mental health concerns.
Thanks, Marie. Thanks. Thanks to all of our panelists, of course. Thanks to Marie and Angelique and the entire Nobel Conference Committee. Thanks to all the people who have put this together. Thanks again to our audience. And just an invitation you can see in the program next year's topic. I won't talk about that here. It feels like an odd thing to bring up right now. But please, we hope we'll see you back here next year. Thanks. Safe travels on your way home. And thank you so much for being here.